Hello, YouTube, and welcome to today's episode where I've got a guest with me. And I forgot to ask before we started as well, the correct pronunciation of your surname. Is it Ryrie or Ryrie? Because
first time, Ryrie.
Ryrie. Okay, so I live with Alec Ryrie, and you're a lecturer at Durham University over here in the UK. And you've also got how I know about you is through a series of lectures and talks that you've done at Gresham College, which I think is in London. So they're like public talks about the history of Christianity, its interaction with certain kind of flashpoint historical events. And today we're going to be talking about Protestantism. Do you want to say anything else about your background before we get started?
No, that's good. Yeah, I mean, I should just put in a plug for the wider things that Gresham College do. They do a whole series of free public lectures online and in person on a massive range of subjects. And I've got a whole other 6 lecture series with them coming up this year.
Awesome. So that's the first question then for the topic today is, what is a Protestant? So sort of defining our terms, and I mean, maybe that question is a bit more complicated, and we're going to talk about some of the complexities of different denominations and historical definitions and things. But what's a good working definition maybe to get us started along this journey?
It's a deceptively difficult question because the normal working definition, which is broadly what I tried to go with in the book on the history of Protestantism I wrote a few years ago, is the kind of genealogical one. So we're talking about a branch of Christianity that derives from the great split in Western Christendom that starts in the early 16th century, which we call the Reformation. That term's problematic too, but let's go with it. And for reasons of historical accident that we can go into, the collective term that gets applied to all of the different groups that split off from the Roman Catholic Church following that set of schisms is Protestant. And that has come to be used as an umbrella term for a very wide variety of different Christian movements. There are kind of 2 or 3 big denominational families. There's Lutherans, Calvinists of many kinds, Presbyterians, Congregationalists, what have you. There's the kind of strange subset of this which come to be known as Anglicans and have produced themselves many spin-offs. I mean, Methodists ultimately come out of that stable. And then there's a great many others as well. And a lot of people within those families will argue about who counts as really a Protestant and who doesn't. And there'll be a lot of argument about, okay, some groups have gone so far off in some particular direction that they no longer really count as part of the family.
Anyone using incense? I like incense. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I just trespassed on one of these problems by putting Anglicans within that family. Actually, I've got a problem with the word Anglican too, but maybe let's not go there today. There are a lot of Anglicans who are uneasy about claiming that Protestant heritage for themselves, even though most of the rest of the world sees them that way. I'm just suspicious of any of these attempts to draw kind of clear doctrinal lines, because those efforts are usually undertaken with some kind of agenda in view, if not actively, maliciously, as a way of trying to exclude people and decide, I'm in and you're out.
Right, sure.
I want to take really a kind of genealogical view and say that there's a family resemblance between these different groups, and therefore that you've got to be inclusive. I mean, families don't necessarily get on. They're perfectly capable of having any number of black sheep and of excluding and anathematizing each other, but nevertheless they remain at a profound level related and connected to each other. So, as I've defined it, Protestantism is a movement that includes, as we get into the modern world, a great many groups that are sometimes classed as sects, and I think absolutely includes Pentecostalism. That's become such a huge phenomenon in the 20th century. I mean, I actually think Pentecostalism is smack in the middle of the Protestant tradition and has very deep roots within it. The point where even I find myself running up against limits is with Mormonism, which clearly comes out of a Protestant heritage, but has gone in such a different direction and has so many really distinctive elements to it that I think it does a disservice both to Protestants and to Mormons to describe them as essentially part of the same movement. I think Mormonism is so I think it amounts to a new religion. It's as distinct from Protestantism and from historic Christianity as Christianity is from Judaism.
Yeah, I think I'm sympathetic with that view, but I do have two. I have an ex-Mormon friend and a current Mormon friend, and both of them would want to have one of them describe themselves as having been a Christian at that time, and the other one would say they are a Christian. So maybe I should talk to them about their views on that at some point. So go. Sorry, was there something else you wanted to say?
Yeah, no, I know. I guess I would distinguish between Mormonism's wish to claim the identity of Christian for itself, which is clearly part of Mormon identity. It's there in the title of the church. Christ is at the center of it, and that's legitimate in its own terms. But I think really what we're talking about is a kind of a dispute over what Christianity is.
Yeah, right.
I think applying the word Protestant to them is really a bit of a stretch.
So going back then to the sort of split from Catholicism, which is the historical event, which you said kind of broadly, or all of these things that come under Protestantism share in common is this kind of genealogical or etymological kind of historical root. Well, first, what is that event? Why does it happen? What kind of leads up to it? What's the story there?
Okay, well, there's a storybook answer to that, which is that on the 31st of October 1517, Martin Luther went and nailed 95 theses to the door of the castle church in Wittenberg, and that started the Reformation. And that's not true. That it's most unlikely that any theses were actually affixed to the door of the castle church. If it did happen, Luther almost certainly wouldn't have done it himself.
Right.
But it is true that Martin Luther, who is at that date an up-and-coming theologian who's become quite prominent within the Augustinian order of monks within Germany, and has a fairly distinguished academic position at a kind of scrappy new university at Wittenberg in Saxony. So he's not exactly a national or international figure, but he's not nobody either. Decides that he wants to make a protest against the fundraising activity that's going on by some Dominican friars around him. He doesn't realize that this has actually been sponsored by his own archbishop. Okay. And it's a program which he sees as being theologically as well as ethically corrupt, and those two are connected for him. And it's the kind of his drawing up these theses to protest against it is a kind of perfectly normal academic maneuver. He's saying, look, there's a problem here. We should hand it to the theologians, bring it back into the academy, and we can sort it out. But he has stepped on some sensitive issues. I mean, not least, he's threatening people's income stream. And he's also done it in an inflammatory way. He's discovering already, or just beginning to discover, that he's got a real knack for rabble-rousing rhetoric, for couching his ideas in such a way as to be pouring petrol and chucking matches around. And so when these theses makes them sound huge. They're like bullet points, kind of little sort of one or two sentence kind of assertions for discussion.
Like if the Pope can forgive all the sins, then why doesn't he just do it like that sort of thing?
Exactly. That's one of them. And he has 95 of these things. Absolutely standard form of academic argument. There aren't always 95, but you just make the points you want to make. Somebody else picks them up, apparently without his knowledge, translates them into German. Of course, originally it's in Latin because it's all part of academic debate. They get printed, and suddenly the whole thing catches fire. There's a great deal of interest in what he's doing. He is told firmly by the church authorities to back down. And of course, most people under those circumstances would, but Luther turns out, as well as being an effective rabble-rouser, to be an unusually stubborn human being.
Right.
And he's also in a particular moment. A whole series of factors come together to mean that of all the points of tension that the later medieval church had been enduring, this one happens in just such a way, in just such a time and place, as to make it impossible for it to be, well, maybe not impossible, but it as it plays out, it is not actually effectively clamped down.
Right.
It's a moment of political hiatus in Germany. The Holy Roman Emperor, the sovereign of the whole of Germany, is at the point of death. There's going to be an election for a new emperor. One of the electors, one of the 7 electors, is going to choose the new emperor. Just so happens to be the founder and patron of Wittenberg University. So it's a bad time for anybody to start a fight over one of his star professors.
Right.
You've got this new technology of printing with movable type, which has been around for half a century or so, and is really starting to spread. Luther finds himself being able to use this to reach a mass audience, bypass the normal kind of polite indoors modes of theological discourse in a way that really nobody has quite managed to do before. He stumbles into this. And he's picking up on a series of rumbling discontents with the ecclesiastical establishment, which had been around for a few decades. Some aspects of it coming to a head. The so-called Renaissance humanists questioning a lot of what they see as the superstition and corruption associated with the church.
Is that that's people like Erasmus and Petrarch and?
Yeah, I mean those are a couple of centuries apart. But Erasmus, okay, who's Luther's contemporary, is initially sees Luther as part of this same movement.
Right.
And only takes a surprisingly long time, a few years, for it really to become clear that the kind of critique Luther is making is greater than just wanting to tidy the church up around the edges and deal with some superstition and corruption and turn towards a more sort of refined inner piety, but that he really is advancing a profound theological critique, which if you take it to its fullest logical extent, and often Luther is wary about following through his arguments fully, is going to sweep away much of the structure of the church as it had been known.
Right.
It means that hierarchies, priests, sacraments, much of the kind of day-to-day business of Christianity starts to look like it plays a supporting role in the Christian life. At best, it may even be unnecessary or actively an obstacle. Luther's approach famously is summed up as sola fide, faith alone, and it's that intense and immediate relationship with God in Christ that he wants to pursue, which he sees as marginalizing everything else. So, I mean, one of the great questions about the Reformation, to what extent is it about Luther, or to what extent was he just the person who was in the right place at the right time? And obviously, there's no definitive answer to that because we don't know what would have happened. My sense is that there was certainly scope for some major movement of reform or reworking of the church's structure, challenge to the really deep-seated problems of the papacy, particularly as an institution as it existed in that period. But the distinctive contribution that Luther makes is to find a way of doing this which is based on a really radical and persuasive theological critique. If it wasn't for that, then it might have been possible to hold the whole church together to avoid the schism, because much of the mood of these movements is there's a very wide appeal to it, but the radicalism of Luther's theological critique is simply unacceptable to a lot of his contemporaries. So you could imagine that there could have been a sort of a softer, more house-trained version of the Reformation. On the other hand, McCulloch in his book on the Reformation says, the old church is very strong, and if it's to destroy something strong, you need something strong in return.
Right.
And it's the power, the kind of corrosive nature of Luther's idea, which is like acid poured onto the structure of the old church. It eats away at it and cuts through all its tangles and complexities.
Were there many before this point? Were there many people with similar theologies? I mean, I'm aware of Jan Hus, who I think was burnt a bit before, and also I hear of the Waldensians. I don't know, how many people kind of came to similar conclusions as Luther beforehand.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good point. You've got this series of dissident or reforming movements through the later Middle Ages, and I mean, stretching way back. Huss is almost exactly a century before Luther. Okay. The Waldensians are 12th century origin. You've got the so-called Lollards, who looked to John Wycliffe in England in the late 14th century. He's a significant influence on Huss as well. So there are this whole series of movements, and many of them are pretty similar. They're looking for a piety which empowers lay people, which wants to put the Bible into as many people's hands as possible, is opposed to clerical privileges and corruption and all those sorts of questions. None of them really take off. The partial exception to that is the Hussites, who do become a substantial movement within Bohemia, within what's now the Czech Republic, but it stays confined to that particular region. And you could argue that that's because none of them have got the political factors coalescing as Luther does. None of them have got access to the printing press. And I mean, that is significant. But also, none of them have got a theological critique of quite really of anything like Luther's clarity or radicalism. They're talking about structural change, about empowering lay people. They're not talking about an entirely rebased relationship with God based on faith alone, which can provide a really deep and consistent ideological basis for sweeping aside the structures of the church. So I know it's unfashionable to see theology as a driving force in major historical events. I do think when you're talking about the Protestant Reformation, it's hard to get away from the fact that without Luther, the theological breakthroughs that he makes and the ways in which he is able to communicate them and to pick them up, to use them to pick up and crystallize a whole range of the ideas that are out there in the culture at the time. Without that, hard to see it happen.
So then what happens, how are Luther's ideas received by the Catholic Church? How do they respond to that? And then how do we kind of get the resulting movement that ends up sort of rejecting Catholicism outright and leading into political schisms, wars, and so forth? And how does this tie in with what's going on in other geographical locations as well? Like when exactly, do other movements?
Yeah, I mean that's a big set of questions.
Sure.
So you might want to keep me on a short leash here.
Okay.
But it's worth remembering that the outcome that we get, in which we get a schism that you can depict on a map, that parts of Europe adopt this new movement, let's call it Protestant, and parts remain remain loyal to, in communion with the papacy and what we then have to start calling the Roman Catholic Church.
Right.
That is not an obvious outcome. In fact, it's the bizarre way for this crisis to play out. Luther's aim is not to go into schism, but to reform the church from within. And the expectations of his early supporters are either that they will sweep everything before them, or that they will be completely wiped out. Luther himself, who has a kind of apocalyptic lugubriousness to him, expects that this will fail and that he'll become a martyr.
Right.
Or in some moods he expects that. There's a point in the early 1520s, so in the few years after the movement begins, when it really seems in Germany as if it's sweeping everything before it, as if this is becoming an orthodoxy.
Right.
Around which the whole of Germany, the whole of Central Europe might coalesce. And you've also got a lot of people in Italy, in France, elsewhere, who may not want to sign up to everything that Luther says. It's already pretty clear that Luther is quite a wild guy and is capable of saying things without really fully thinking them through, but are profoundly impressed by some of the core of his ideas and find the theological power of what he's saying difficult to reject outright. So it really does look as if some kind of thoroughgoing reform, which of the whole church, of the Catholic Church, which incorporates Luther's insights, might be possible. Then in Germany, you get this great crisis, the rebellion in 1524 to 25, the so-called Peasants' War, the biggest mass rebellion in European history before the French Revolution, in which some of the more radical voices who have come out of Luther's movement are associated with. Luther himself denounces all this quite late in the day. But it forces a decision. And for most of the German cities and princes, the decision is to say, no, enough of this craziness. We're going to run back to orthodoxy. There's a significant minority who say, no, that ship has sailed. We can't go back all the way back there. And so we're going to go with Luther rather than with the crazy people. We're going to pick Luther himself out as a kind of middle course.
Right.
But that's the point at which a really comprehensive movement for reform starts to look impossible. But I mean, that's what we say with hindsight. Right through the 1530s into the early 1540s, there are still very serious people who are saying, no, we can do this. We can find a way of synthesizing the best of Luther's ideas. The Holy Roman Emperor himself, Charles V, who's is a loyal son of the Roman Catholic Church, is very keen to try to push some kind of compromise deal through, and he sponsors this great summit conference, which meets at Regensburg in 1541, which comes achingly close to striking some sort of deal. And even after that fails, through the 1540s into the 1550s, you've got a series of very high-profile people like Archbishop Elector von Wied of Cologne, or Archbishop Hamilton of St Andrews, the primate of the Scottish Church, and on the Protestant side, people like Archbishop Cranmer in England, who are trying to keep in touch with each other, think about what they can, how some sort of comprehensive deal could be synthesized to avoid this catastrophe of schism, of permanently breaking the church into rival regional denominations. And of course, that's the catastrophe as it eventually unfolds, and it is the situation that everybody wanted to avoid, and is regarded as a disaster. One of the reasons why you then have a century of religious warfare is because everybody regards this situation of geographical schism as intolerable. But of course, once you've decided that compromise is impossible, the only way to resolve it is conquest.
Right. So some of the things, I mean, we've skipped over some of the, I don't know, I don't want to say it in like a derogatory way because I don't mean it that way, but like the classic kind of story of the Reformation, with like the diet of worms and Luther turning up, here I stand, I can do no other, and then going outside, being I don't know that it happens exactly like that, because I always remember it from a Martin Luther film I watched, but like being kidnapped and going to a castle, translating the Bible and all that. But I think
that does happen pretty much like it's shown.
But the thing I want to go on to then is some other groups of reformers, the Calvinists, for example, where do they come from then? Is it, how do they spring up? Is it just kind of is it off the back of the stuff that Luther's done and that's kind of caused political upheaval? Is it a similar story where there's people who are in kind of monasteries but have different theological ideas, and then they end up just kind of working those ideas out differently? How does Calvinism come about? Obviously, one individual, John Calvin, is going to be significant in that story, but yeah,
he is, but he plays a different role in Calvinism than Luther does in Lutheranism, because Calvin is 8 years old when Luther publishes his 95 Theses. He is a second generation figure in the Reformation, and the movement that we call Calvinism, and it's a problematic term partly for that reason, is always a much more collective movement than what Luther does. It's often portrayed as if Lutheranism is the more kind of moderate version, and Calvinism the more extreme of Protestantism. And there are some dimensions in which that's so. I think it's also really, really misleading. Certainly Lutherans themselves would regard, Lutherans say that they themselves are the more kind of clear and purebred version of Protestant theology, whereas Calvinism has kind of corrupted itself with a kind of textualism and rationalism that strays back towards towards Erasmus and those kinds of Renaissance humanist ideas. This is a movement that comes out of a very different political milieu, out of Switzerland, the republics, the independent little republics that formed the Swiss Confederation, and out of the big city-states of southern Germany, places like Strasbourg. The key figure in starting it is a man named Ulrich Zwingli, who's a Swiss who's become the city preacher of Zurich. Zwingli claimed to have reached his theology of justification, of faith alone, independently of Luther. That seems implausible given how similar they are and how close the time frame is. We'll know more when Bruce Gordon brings his book on Zwingli out, which is just about to appear, and we're all kind of waiting on tenterhooks for this.
Okay.
But I think until Bruce proves me wrong, the assumption is that even if Zwingli thought he got there independently, he's nevertheless affected by Luther's movement. But it is clear that from the very beginning, within a few months, you have this distinct form of this, anti-papal, anti-hierarchical, faith-based, radically simplifying revolution. And everybody can see that these two movements ought to be allies, that they agree on 95% of what they're doing, and everybody can see that getting over that last 5% is going to be phenomenally difficult. There's a series of specific issues that they disagree about, of which the most profound is the nature of the Eucharist, of precisely what happens to the bread and wine that are consecrated in the Holy Communion. But in some ways, those specific issues are only symptoms of the deeper disagreement between them, the pattern of thought that they each have, in which the Reformed, as we call this, Reformed with the capital R is the best umbrella term for this Zwinglian Calvinist movement, are more law-based, more structured. They're interested in that kind of thoroughgoing reform, re-legislating what the Christian life should be like. Luther, who regards law as something that Christians ought to rise above entirely, he wants to replace law with gospel in Pauline, sees that whole approach as fundamentally misguided, as symptomatic of what's wrong with all of it. There is this famous summit conference between Luther and Zwingli at the German city of Marburg in 1529, where the political protectors that both men have by then acquired are desperately trying to get them to reach an agreement, because they're in a very exposed position and their two main leaders can't sit in the same room as each other. This is bad. This whole thing is carefully stage managed, and it just falls apart because neither Luther or Zwingli can be pushed to do this. It's a contest between Zwingli's condescension, in which he's kind of saying to Luther, look, don't you realize that you're still sunk in superstition and that you need to embrace the clarity and purity of my vision? and the outrage of that Luther has at the way that, as he sees it, Zwingli is just tearing up scripture to make it say what he thinks it ought to say. Calvin, who's a French lawyer who comes along, lawyer, again, that law element is important, comes along in the next generation as this bright young man, exceptionally bright young man, who thinks he can solve this. And that he can find a way of uniting the two different movements, and then potentially, bringing in lots of these reformist Catholics as well. And he goes some way towards it. He takes what had become a very vociferous reformed movement that, especially after Zwingli's death, is splitting off into a lot of different angles, and manages to hold it together and bring in some of the more kind of wild-eyed Zwinglian radicals and form what he thinks could be a kind of a consensual reformist center around which a united Protestantism can form. And he really seems to think that he can get the Lutherans on board with this as well, but it's not going to happen. And so that's the last really serious attempt that Calvin makes to unite at least the Protestant world around a single banner. In some ways, he gets a surprisingly long way, and which is why we do have something that you could call Calvinism. He takes this disparate, quarrelsome set of groups arising out of that Swiss South German milieu and melds them into a single force, which then in the 1550s and 60s starts winning support right across the continent. And you see this so-called Second Reformation movement of people who are kind of broadly Calvinist, taking power or achieving significant steps in Scotland, in the Netherlands, in France, in Transylvania, a whole series of these movements cropping up elsewhere. England, indeed, although England is a slightly special case.
Right.
But by that stage, it's clear that the Calvinists and the Lutherans regard each other with, well, on the Lutheran side, real contempt and also wariness. On the Calvinist side, a certain wistful, yes, surely we recognize that we could all be together here, but also, a willingness to dismiss what the Lutherans thought were serious issues. So it's not going to happen.
So at this point, we've had a load of really good questions come in. I should have said at the start for people in the chat that today we are going to be stopping at the hour, so we're not going to have time to take loads of questions. But I guess we could take a couple now if you want to do that, and then if you want to, we can kind of continue the story of Protestantism at a point in future and maybe take people through the history in a few sessions or something, because it's such a big topic. It's very difficult to do it.
It is a big topic, and I'll keep on talking about this stuff till the last person turns out the lights and leaves the room. So,
well, I definitely have questions about the English Reformation, but again, that's a bit a massive field in and of itself. The Scottish Reformation, and then further questions about the types of things you start talking about in your book, I guess. I mean, how Protestantism develops through the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, the discovery of America, the Counter Reformation, how that affects things. The ideas of nationalism, like you say, all the things that start happening in America that you mentioned in the book with various different movements, ways of doing systematic theology. There's so many different and interesting topics to talk about. And I think, I've got a lot of Americans who watch at least a couple of people I know who are ex-Mennonites. So that's an interesting story. But politically, all the stuff going on in America politically right now with evangelicals and Trump, I think that can I think that understanding the history behind that story can be really important for people as well as they come to engage with religion and figure out what's going on. But maybe for now, if we just go with some of the questions from the chat. So Eric Johnson, who said earlier, actually, he said thank you because you'd helped him out with his masters that he was doing as well. Yeah, he said his masters was on Puritan theology, and he learnt more from Dr. Ryrie than in seminary. So great guest. And his question was, how did you find so many Puritan quotes about doubt cited in your book, Unbelievers?
Thanks for the question, Eric. I'm afraid it's kind of a boring answer, which is just that I read a whole lot of Puritans. In particular, when I was writing the previous book about that, which was about pious praxis and patterns of prayer and so forth in the Church of England, and in the Scottish Church in the late 16th, early 17th century, I was reading a whole lot of Puritan autobiographies and diaries, people trying to describe their own inner spiritual experience. And I was just struck by the number of them who were talking about doubt, profound doubt, atheism, doubting whether there is a God. They talk about it in terms as explicit as that. And I started keeping track of these things because I thought, hang on a second, this is not what I expect to find in this sort of literature. There might be something going on here. And then once you start pulling at a thread, then you find out how much of it there is, and you begin to follow your nose and come up with other examples of it. If it looks like I found a lot, one reason I was able to do it is because there's actually quite a lot out there. I was not scraping the barrel in that book. It's a story about which more could be said.
Awesome. So another question that came in from Mind Onion, who asks, how did it become culturally acceptable to try and question church hierarchy, who presumably would be considered experts with long traditions?
That's a great question, because I think this goes right to the heart of what Protestantism is, and I mean absolutely bears on some of the kind of culture war issues that you were alluding to just now. This is right at the heart of the Protestant movement. When Luther first comes up with his protest, he is questioning the hierarchy. Now, as a professor of theology, to some extent, he's licensed to do that. That's kind of his role. He's part of the hierarchy himself, and he has this position. But he is then authoritatively told that he's wrong and that he should shut up, and refuses to do so. And the key moment that Nathan mentioned earlier of his career, the most kind of vivid public confrontation of Luther's life, a moment that both he and his supporters keep going back to, is this great confrontation at the Diet of Worms, the parliament of the German Empire, in April 1521, when he is summoned before all the princes and bishops of Germany to account for his defiance of the church. And he goes at least half expecting that he's going to be killed, that he's going to be arrested and put to death as a heretic. He has been given a promise that won't happen, but he's well aware that such promises have been broken before. And the idea that he might face a martyr's death has its appeal to him. He's clearly very scared as well. But I think that sense that he's putting his life on the line is important to understand the way that he responds. He's already decided to go and risk his life. So in that sense, he really has nothing to lose. And so when he is asked, he's given formally given the opportunity to walk back his statements, to recant his heresy. And he famously says, I cannot do so because my conscience is captive to the word of God, and it is neither safe nor right to go against conscience. And so it's that appeal above the hierarchy and the experts, the arrayed theologians and bishops who are facing him. He's saying, no, it's not just that I think I'm right and you're wrong, but my reading of the highest authority of all, of Scripture, trumps anything that you folks say. And so he is appealing to a higher authority that goes above any of them. But that means that he, as a relatively lowly individual within this, is bypassing the chain of command. He's going directly to God and
right.
saying that he is taking his authority from the Word of God, from Scripture. And if the bishops, the theologians are saying to him, but that's not what Scripture says, that's not what it means, he's saying, no, my conscience tells me that it does, and that the meaning of it is clear. And that instinct, that refusal to take what you're told on authority, has been an absolutely persistent feature of Protestant thought, and I think of Western thought more widely since then. And nowadays we're all very fussed about, rightly so, about misinformation and conspiracy theories, and anti-vaxxing and whatever. Get your vaccines, folks. That instinct to say no, I'm going to reject expertise and say I, as a private individual, can work things out for myself, and I know better than the experts. That, from where we are right now in 2021, looks like a dangerous, sometimes deluded position. But I think we need to recognize how important and powerful it is. That willingness to refuse to take authoritative judgments simply because they are pronounced in a booming voice, to refuse to accept authority because it says so, but to insist that everybody enters the sphere of argument on equal terms, and that even a relatively lowly individual, Luther is also keen to emphasize his status as a doctor of theology and so forth, but there are others who come beyond him who have no status of any kind, who are claiming the same privileges, are saying, nobody other than God can tell me what to think, and it's possible for me to appeal beyond those, any of the human authorities I look at. Which means that if a human authority wants somebody to listen to them, they've actually got to persuade rather than laying down the law. And although the persuading thing is sometimes kind of tedious, I tend to think that I would rather have live in a world which has people who are a little too ready to be skeptical than people who are a little too ready to be credulous.
So there's a story about Cardinal John Henry Newman when he went over to the Pope to see the Pope, and sat down at dinner, and he said something like, to raise a toast to conscience, who's Christ's first vicar on earth, and then to the Pope second, or something like that. How would that kind of sentiment have been received in Luther's time? Would that sentiment have been sort of viewed as, I don't know, anathema in some sense, or would it have been viewed as by Orthodox Catholics? Not that they're thinking in those terms of being Roman Catholics. Would that have been viewed as an acceptable sort of theological position?
If it would depend on the circumstances in which you said it. I mean, that if that's framed explicitly as a kick at the Pope's shin, right, then that's going to cause you trouble, no matter what. But Yeah, that broad. I mean, that obviously anybody on the Protestant side is going to, well, they are going to have a problem with that because they're going to dislike the presence of the Pope in your hierarchy.
Yeah.
But valorizing conscience in that sense, absolutely. But for an awful lot of those who remain within the Catholic fold as well, that kind of approach would seem unexceptionable or self-evidently true. I mean, we need to remember that the papacy in the Renaissance era, the era of the Borgias and the Medicis, is not self-evidently a kind of moral lamp to the world. It looks like part of the problem rather than part of the solution. And for a lot of the most serious reforming Catholics of the first half and middle of the 16th century, their faith in what the papacy as an institution is or should be has to be held to some extent in defiance of the observed behavior of the individuals who actually hold that office.
Right.
One of the really remarkable changes that comes about during the 16th century as a result of the movement, which you can call the Counter Reformation, again the term's problem, is a renewal of the kind of moral seriousness and moral authority of the papacy from the kind of 1560s onwards, in which rather unexpectedly it turns out to be able to rise to the challenge of reforming the church internally, and pushing back against against the Protestant threat. If it had been able to do that a century or so earlier, then things might have been different.
Yes, I can. Brilliant. So there are a few more questions from the audience, but just due to time, I've got one last question then before we wrap up for today, and maybe 10 minutes or just under 10 minutes isn't enough to do it justice, but it would be how, for you being part of the one true church, the Church of England, as a lay preacher, how has sort of studying the history of the Reformation and the various, I mean, presumably there's a lot of people with ideas you disagree with as well within the Reformation movement. How has that shaped your personal understanding of what it is to be a Protestant, and why you're a Protestant? How has studying the history kind of interacted and shaped that those beliefs that you have?
That's a good and deep question, which I probably can't give an adequate answer to. But let me give it a shot. I mean, I identify as a Protestant Christian because I think, broadly speaking, the nature of the kinds of critiques that are being made within that broad Protestant movement seem to me compelling, and so while I recognize the importance of the historic church, which in a Western context has to mean the Church of Rome, I don't find myself able to be a part of it. And living in England, then I think you then find yourself in the Church of England by default. I've still got plenty of problems with the Church of England, which I would like to think of as the Church of England, as a kind of an open, inclusive, plural place for English Christians who are willing to work together. Too often, it becomes instead the Anglican Church, a denomination with strict rules, which often seem to be based more around who can be excluded than who can be included. So I'm very happy to identify myself as a minister of the Church of England. I dislike calling myself an Anglican, although sometimes for clarity the term's unavoidable. It seems to me that one of the persistent patterns of the history of the Church of England is of its expulsion and exclusion of people who should not be treated that way. The Puritans are talked about as if they don't really belong, as if they were only ever cuckoos in the nest. There's then the throwing out of a great many English Christians from the church after the Restoration in 1662. There's the expulsion of the Methodists, and other points of exclusion, which seem to me to be a shameful history. And the more I've studied that, the more uneasy about some of the denominational baggage that the Church of England has chosen to collect around itself. I've become. One feature of that is its relationship with the Anglican Communion, where there are obviously kind of deep and historic connections there, which are important and need to be honoured. I think we also need to recognise that the Church of England is the most anomalous church in the Anglican Communion. It's unlike any of the others. It's an established church. It has this, not entirely unrealistic aspiration to be the church of the entire nation. It's an aspiration which it has repeatedly failed to live up to, but nevertheless, it is a serious and, I think, in its own terms, a worthwhile aspiration. It does mean that I think we pay, we as in the Church of England, we pay a lot of attention to nurturing our relationships with other Anglican churches around the world, and not very much attention to nurturing our relationships with other Christian churches in this country. And that priority seems to me a little perverse.
Right. Yeah, no, that's an interesting answer. I think if you're happy to do a few more of these where we can kind of like follow on chronologically, sort of from where we got to today with the story, because I definitely have more questions as well off the back of the history about what it means, to you as a Protestant today. So I think the chapters on slavery in the book where you talk about people arguing, say, from scripture, like in favor of slavery, and then people arguing, well, it's just, like an obvious moral intuition that as a Christian, I'm against slavery, and how, how looking at those kind of debates and discussions then informs, well, then as a modern Christian, how do you then, look at historically how people have done this and come to deal with things like that? So I'm really interested in all those sorts of questions and what your answers to them would be. But yeah, I want to respect the time for today, so we'll leave it there. Is there anywhere, aside from the Gresham College stuff, which we said at the start, is there anywhere else where people can go to get in touch with you or see more of what you do?
No, I mean, Gresham would be the obvious place, and there's a bunch of books out there.
Yeah, and this is one of them, the one I'm broadly working through. So I've really enjoyed reading this on my holiday last week a bit, and I'm finishing it this week, hopefully. So yeah, thanks everyone for watching. I'll play just the ending credits, and if you want to hang around after, you can. It'll just be, 20 seconds or so. But yeah, thanks everyone. If you enjoyed this, be sure to share it around with someone who you think will enjoy it, and leave a comment letting me know what you think. Bye.
Thanks very much, Nathan.